question about accessibility to the law is really challenging. And one thing I should note here, and perhaps I should have started with this, is anytime you speak in generalizations about standards, you are in great peril, because there is such a wide diversity in terms of the kinds of standards that exist, the organizations that create them, the purposes for which they are used, the reasons why they're important, and the people who actually need access to the standards. And so one of the challenges for fashioning a government-wide policy on these questions of access is that you could create a solution that might work in one regulatory context but could be disastrous in another context. And so anytime you're sort of trying to come up with a solution, you have to find one that is going to accommodate the great variety of circumstances that exist in the world of standards, and especially in the world of incorporation by reference of those standards. Now, in terms of the costs of the standards, many members of industry who are actually required to comply with the regulations, they frequently are already involved in the standards development process in the private sector. Oftentimes they have copies of the standard by virtue of their participation in that process. And in fact, they may have extraordinarily detailed information about it because the employees in that industry are the ones who volunteer their time to participate in the technical committees to craft the standards. But in addition, you may need the standards if you're a member of industry, not because a federal regulation requires you to have them, but because in order to participate in your industry, you have to have access to those standards, and you may have to comply with those standards in order to, for example, and I will just keep coming back to the steel example, but if you're going to sell steel, you need access to those standards, not because there's a federal regulation that requires it, but because you need to know what kind of equipment you need, what kind of processes you need to have in order to make the kind of steel that people want to buy. And so oftentimes participants in the industry have other reasons why they're paying for copies of the standard, and the federal regulatory requirement actually is not prime among them. Now, the bigger problem, it seems to me, in terms of access is actually for the public and for people who are interested in what federal regulations require. And in some cases, it may be because they're required to comply. More often, I would suggest that it's more because they have an interest in knowing what the rules are, even if they're not directly required to comply with them. They may be beneficiaries of those rules, right? So health and safety regulations, oftentimes consumers don't have to comply with those regulations, but they're very interested in what those regulations are because those regulations are designed to protect them. To protect their health and safety. And so they may have an interest in knowing what the standards are and reading those standards in order to participate meaningfully in the regulatory process, in the rulemaking process, and to ensure that federal agencies are considering the consumer's perspective as well as the perspective of the members of industry who are going to be directly regulated. So in a certain sense, they're in a core way affected by these regulations, even if they're not required to comply with them as a legal matter. So the question becomes, how do you come up with a solution that will make these standards ideally freely accessible online without breaking some other part of the system, right? Because everything is sort of interconnected. And I'll come here for a moment to talk just a little bit about the revenue model that would be at stake if you sort of abolished the copyright. And in fact, some folks who have been pushing for free access to incorporated standards have done it by saying, well, once they're incorporated, once they're part of the law, they shouldn't be copyrighted. And the problem with that is that then you have standards development organizations who have to find some other way to fund their process that doesn't involve selling copies of their standards because they can no longer copyright them. And the alternatives are relatively few, and all of them have problems of their own. So for example, instead of selling copies of the standards, a standards development organization could charge membership fees or fees for participation in the standards development process. And some of the organizations do this because they're professional societies and that's part of their funding model. But the downside of that, of course, is that then you're making it more expensive for people to participate in the development of those standards. And what does that do to participation in the standards? For the last several decades, federal standards policy has really pushed private sector organizations to use voluntary consensus procedures that, among other things, are designed to make the process more inclusive and get all of those interests to the table when the standard's actually being created. If it's really expensive to participate in the standards development process, you may be making it more difficult for people like consumer advocates, nonprofit organizations, academics to participate in that, and you may be giving a benefit to the bigger players in the industry who have deep pockets and an ability to pay those costs. And so you could actually end up undermining the standards development process in a way that really degrades the quality of the standards themselves, even though what you were trying to do was solve a downstream problem. Now, another way to address this if you're a standards development organization is say, okay, well, we don't want to charge big fees for membership and we don't want to rely on our copyright, so instead we're going to rely on donations. But again, this creates a problem of potentially imperiling the independence of the standards development organizations as they become financially dependent on large donors for the standards development process. And so, for example, the National Fire Protection Association, several years ago at Standards Week, the president of NFPA was there, and he was talking about how they've actually encountered this. They get donations, and they had a big donor who was unhappy with the way a particular technical committee was going with a standard, and they threatened to pull their money. And fortunately, NFPA also sells copies of their standards and has lots of other sources of revenue, and they were able to say, well, if you don't like it, keep your money. But if they relied exclusively on donations, that ability to be independent, that ability to maintain the integrity of the standards development process could be compromised. The other thing to note in this context is that, as I mentioned, there's only a small percentage of standards that are incorporated by reference into federal regulations, and it tends to be some core big standards. For most standards development organizations, they do one standard that's really important, that's really big, that has a big market, and that generates most of their revenue. And then they generate other standards that are needed for economic purposes, for technical purposes, for safety reasons, but that aren't big sellers. And so oftentimes what you have is an organization will get most of its revenue from one or two standards. So ASME, again coming back to the Boiler and Pressure Vessel Code, the Boiler and Pressure Vessel Code is the basis of most of ASME's funding and reputation. And they produce all kinds of other standards that they wouldn't be able to produce if they didn't get a sufficient degree of revenue from this other standard that's more commercially valuable. And one of the perverse things here, one of the sort of unfortunate realities, is that the standards that tend to be incorporated by reference that we want to make available for free online tend to be those big standards that are really valuable and that tend to generate most of the revenue for the standards development organizations. So it's not simply a matter of saying, well, if only 2 to 4% of standards are incorporated by reference, you don't need to get revenue from those standards. No, because it turns out that it's only those 2 to 4%, largely the same standards, that are producing most of the revenue to support the entire private standards system. And of course, another difficulty here is that if you put the standards online for free, right, you can't constrain who's going to look at it or for what purpose. So maybe your intention is just to make it so that consumers who aren't otherwise involved in the process and don't otherwise have access to the standards can see them and then participate in rulemaking or understand what's required by federal regulations. But you can't just say, but it's only those consumers who have this public law reason to look at the standards who can look at them. Once you put them on the internet, they're available to everyone. And so all of those people who would have bought copies of the standards now maybe won't, because why pay for something you can get for free?